Before 1991, there was a country called the USSR, which stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was the largest country in the world, covering about 22.4 million square kilometers, almost twice the size of Europe. The USSR had many problems. One of the biggest was the lack of freedom. People could not freely say what they thought or do what they wanted. Everything began to change in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the country and started reforms called perestroika and glasnost. These reforms allowed people to speak more openly and be more free. And when people are finally allowed to talk, they usually start by talking about problems. One of the biggest problems in the USSR was the question of independence. You see, the USSR was made up of 15 republics, similar to how the United States is made up of 50 states. But there was an important difference. Some countries are independent, which means they are sovereign. They make their own decisions. Imagine moving out of your parents' house and living on your own. You decide how to live. That's independence. Other countries are dependent. They must follow decisions made by a central power. Imagine still living with your parents. They set the rules. You depend on them. In the USSR, real power was concentrated in Moscow, and the republics had limited freedom. And unlike parents, a central government is not always kind or fair. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was one of these republics. For many years, Ukrainian language, culture, and history were restricted or suppressed, and Ukrainians were encouraged to become more Russian. Russia was the dominant republic within the USSR. At the same time, Ukraine and Russia really are closely connected. Russians and Ukrainians share Slavic roots, a long common history, Orthodox Christianity, and similar-sounding languages, much like how English and German share Germanic roots. But in the USSR, this similarity was taken too far. The government tried to turn Ukrainians and Russians into one single people. Many Ukrainians strongly disagreed with this. After 1985, they finally began to speak openly about it. In 1991, something shocking happened. The USSR collapsed. It was replaced by 15 independent countries, including Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine officially became independent after a nationwide referendum where more than 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence. Both Russia and Ukraine started their journey as democratic states. Democracy means that people choose their leaders, for example, presidents or parliaments, through elections. Now pay attention, because this part is very important. In 1954, the Crimean Peninsula was transferred from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic. At the time, this decision did not seem very important because both republics were part of the same country, the USSR. Crimea was geographically connected to Ukraine, so managing it from Ukraine was easier. But after 1991, everything changed. Ukraine became independent with Crimea as part of its territory, and Russia officially recognized Crimea as Ukrainian. For many years, Ukraine and Russia had a complicated but cooperative relationship. However, over time, their paths began to diverge. Russia wanted to become a great power again. Ukraine increasingly wanted closer ties with Europe and the United States. In 2004, Ukraine experienced a major political crisis known as the Orange Revolution. A revolution is a moment when a political system changes suddenly, often after protests. The reason was election fraud, when election results are manipulated and people believe the vote was unfair. After this, Ukraine moved in a more pro-European direction, which damaged relations with Russia. In 2010, a more pro-Russian government came to power, but in 2013 to 2014, massive protests erupted again. This movement is known as Euromaidan, or the Maidan Revolution. These protests were not only against Russia, they were mainly against corruption and against abandoning closer ties with Europe. In 2014, relations between Russia and Ukraine completely collapsed. Russia sent troops into Ukraine and annexed Crimea. This annexation is considered illegal under international law. Most of the world still recognizes Crimea as part of Ukraine, even though Russia controls it in practice. Soon after that, Russia supported armed groups in eastern Ukraine, in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, where many Russian-speaking people lived. These areas became zones of armed conflict. From 2015 to early 2022, the war continued at a lower intensity. This period is often called a frozen conflict. Fighting existed, but there was no full-scale war. That changed on February 24, 2022. On that day, the Russian president announced that Ukraine was a threat and claimed that people in Donbass were suffering, claims that were largely false or exaggerated. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, calling it a special military operation. In reality, it was the beginning of the largest war in Europe since World War II.